Hello, welcome to Art Salon, South Florida Art Salon. We have been bringing artists from throughout South Florida to an ever-growing audience for over 10 years now. And we're very, very proud of the artists who have spoken here. They're some of the really most interesting, innovative, thoughtful, and respected artists in South Florida. I wanted to tell you that we are a team of three, and behind the scenes, Jerry Kornbluth has been the technological resource and go-to person for most of this time. He records the session, he has built the website, he helps me with the Zoom, and we just keep working at getting the word out that South Florida is a fabulous place for art and artists, and there's a lot of exciting people doing a lot of exciting work. The third person on our team is Dani Tapia, who joined us about a year and a half ago. She will be with us at the end to moderate the discussion. She's always got good questions, and she's a wonderful resource in artists of South Florida herself. She has created something called Art Scene 365, which is an Instagram page and a website that is the go-to resource for finding out who is showing work throughout South Florida at any given time. And sometimes when she travels in other parts of the world, you'll be meeting her later on. And for now, it's my great pleasure to be bringing you Felice Grodin. I've been hearing about her work and seeing her work for a number of years now, and have watched it evolve from room-sized installations that were very architectural and could be walked through. I remember one particular project, the Locust Projects, that was a very fascinating and unique installation. But she's gone from that into a really deep dive into the latest technology and now into the metaverse. So she is going to look with us tonight into the future in two ways. One is the future of technology, but the other way that she's looking into the future is looking into the environment that we live in and projecting what that environment is going to be at some future date, and particularly here in South Florida. So she'll be telling you a lot more about that. I would like to add that she is also very much, I think, a philosopher, and she's an architect. And so she's bringing together art and architecture and the environment and philosophy, and I think her talk is going to be absolutely fascinating. It's my pleasure to welcome Felice Grodin.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just want to first say Happy New Year to everybody, and thank you so much for joining me tonight for this great opportunity. I was talking to Ellie about this, and I was saying this opportunity is so great because it gives an artist a chance to really look back in a sense, and kind of evaluate really what you're doing, you know. And it's rare you get an opportunity to do that just really in one sitting like this. So I just want to thank South Florida Art Salons and everybody for joining. So with that, I'll jump right in. And that was a great introduction, so I'll try to live up to it. So the name of my my talk tonight is Imprints of Virtual Shadows. And as Ellie kind of hinted, you know, there's an element of my work that really does deal with the digital quite directly, but I'm using the term virtual to kind of refer to more of an umbrella concept of a kind of space where things come into being. And so it's kind of an abstract kind of concept, but it's also the idea that things can turn into other things, or that things can sort of transform, right? Things come into a reality. So I wanted to kind of kind of grabbed that as a kind of entry point to tonight. And so just some of the themes I want to talk about when I go through some threads in my work. One is process. Often you don't get the opportunity to really show how you got there. And I really wanted to share that with you tonight and just hopefully kind of map a kind of trajectory, because I think the way I work is very process oriented. And the other thing is I'm really interested in material and what I'll call immaterial transformations, where through my process I go from kind of one thing to another. And I think that'll make more sense as we move along. And then importing and exporting between what I'll call modalities or more familiar mediums and realities. And then scaling is kind of, I think, something about my work that you'll see where I like to take things that are big and make them small, and vice versa, make things that are small big. So these are kind of some of the themes tonight, and I hope they'll make some sense. I'm going to start with this kind of idea of transformation, which is analog to analog. So we'll just start with the good old analog. And if I go way back, the way I really started is I really started with Jackson Pollock. And, every artist, right, really is familiar, I think, even non-artists are familiar with Jackson Pollock's work. But I was in architecture school, actually. I was in graduate school, and I was really interested in the fact that there was this strange paradox between the way in which Pollock's work was discussed. It was very kind of optical, and dealing with the visual. I mean, Clement Greenberg spoke a lot about Pollock's work in this way. But if you really study how he made his work, he actually would construct it on the floor. It was actually not a vertical, but yet a horizontal kind of method of construction. And he would actually dance in and out of the canvas while he would produce the work. So the work was really a kind of vestige of his own body. And the canvas was basically a territory, that kind of measured this dance. So I was really interested when I was in school if there was this underlying structure to his work, because when you look at it, it just looks like a bunch of paint. And so I thought, well, what if I could really, in a way, spend a lot of time kind of analyzing his work, and particularly in his paintings, the kind of surface versus the underlay of his paintings. That the underlay always seemed to have this sort of, murky kind of coagulation of paint, and then the surface was kind of much more ethereal. So I started by literally doing a kind of mapping of some of his paintings. So what I would do is I would actually put a piece of mylar, and mylar is this kind of translucent paper that architects are very familiar with, pre-digital, and I would take just a pen, like a technical pen, and literally go through his paintings and begin to extrapolate structure from them. So this drawing, which is really, the paintings are quite large if you've all have seen them in person, but this was kind of a color reduction, and the paper is only 24 by 36 inches, but I would really just draw out these qualities. So for the surface of this painting, this was the resultant drawing. So there were a number of transformations that I was kind of interested in. I was interested in just kind of extrapolating the layers of his paintings, but also I was interested in kind of using my own background, the kind of background that I have when it comes to drawing. I mean, this isn't a perspective. This is what we call orthogonal projection. So it's these sort of extruded masses that became a kind of a way for me to kind of register his paint. And you could see like there's this very simple algorithm. In other words, there's different thicknesses in the ink. So like the sort of more coagulated, kind of thicker the ink was, the kind of thicker the pen weight, kind of lower, kind of denser the fragment would be. And then vice versa. The thinner the paint, the line work would be quite thin and quite high and kind of whimsical. So obviously the resultant architecture is not anything that you necessarily come across in a building, but that was the sort of very reason why I kind of approached this. So the underlay of that very same painting, where the paint was quite thick, had obviously a very different feel to it. So this was very interesting for me. And I mean, I have to say, I didn't really even think of myself as an artist when I was doing this. I was just really just curious about how to kind of transform one kind of element, one kind of piece of art into something else. And so another one of his paintings I did, this one's number 32. These are both from 1950. You could see in this case that it's actually quite, it's just a, it's just a one ink, it's just black ink, but you can see that there's this real variation in terms of the density of that ink from thick to thin. And again, I was quite interested in kind of really drawing out the contrast in this particular painting of the kind of real thick areas to kind of thinner areas. And this was the resultant drawing. And what's also interesting about this particular drawing is you can see that the edges around his painting were edges that I tried to trace. In other words, I tried to trace where he would go in and out of his own painting. So in a way, there's a kind of speculative nature to the way I approached it as well. So this was the result. So this kind of opened up a lot of, I don't know, areas for me because, first of all, I really miss drawing. I mean, this was definitely during a time where most architects are working on the computer all the time. And I just really missed holding a pen. So I basically kept going with this. And what I decided to do at this point was actually just create my own paintings. I said, okay, time to leave Jackson Pollock behind. I felt like I had sort of gone through that, but I'll come back to it later, interestingly. But I decided to kind of create my own paintings at that point. Now, this one, which is probably quite inspired by Jackson Pollock in a way, it's very gestural, it's very, very gestural. And frankly, it probably took me about a minute to do. And that's sort of what was also really interesting for me is that creating these kind of architectural spaces, right, by way of drawing, the painting became a very sort of quick exercise for me to then enter this completely opposite kind of process. So I would begin to, in essence, map my own paintings. And so you could see the resultant drawing. And so this was a bit, safe in a sense. Everything's kind of extruded at the same height. It's very, I would say, similar to the painting. But as I developed this technique, it got more developed. So it got more kind of experimental. So this, I would incorporate color in this case. I'm just going to show the end results now. This one was a bit bigger, so this one must be about 3 by 4 feet. And you can see also that I kind of experimented with the line work. This is very, very kind of dense. And kind of going back to what Ellie was saying about the environment, I would say that through this process, I began to kind of come to grips with the idea that these were landscapes. And maybe they're, microscopic landscapes, that you could look under a microscope with, or cosmic, but there was something kind of interesting in that they were abstract, but there was this kind of, I felt vulnerability that I was getting at, that there was a sense in which there was almost this erosive quality or quality of something that was moving in and of itself. And the detail that I began to really get at was, I don't know, I mean, I would kind of get into these zones. I mean, those of you who are artists kind of understand this. You just kind of disappear into this kind of modality of just almost becoming at one with the process of drawing in this case. But also, I was really interested in just kind of discovering these landscapes, never really knowing what they would look at until I was done. And I think that part of it was having a kind of, I don't know, approach to it a priori. Someone referred to it as an algorithm, which is very interesting in regards to where we're going with the digital stuff. But there was a kind of algorithm, a kind of simple algorithm when it came to technique, when it came to ascribing thicknesses of the pen and where colors would go. So for example, these were obviously two colors or two elements that collide. So there was a kind of coding that I would begin to approach these drawings with that, frankly, when they would come out on the internet, people thought they were digital. They didn't realize that, in fact, these were hand-drawn and they were freehand. These are all freehand drawings. And, if I made a mistake, yes, I would erase, but there wasn't a lot of wiggle room. So there was this real precision, and probably just because of my discipline, as an architect, but I kind of got really down the rabbit hole, quite literally, with a lot of these drawings. I was getting bigger and bigger. That was the other thing that was starting to happen. This one is called, I can't remember now. I think I'm a little nervous. But basically, this one, you could see the difference in this one is that there's actually a figure in the middle. There's this kind of big bug, in a sense. And basically, at the time, I was really interested in also beginning to layer like figural shapes rather than just fields, of color or texture or landscape. And I think I was also interested in this idea of subjectivity, that with this sort of representation of this bug, that we were, in a sense, like this bug, because there's this kind of connection, this kind of nomadic connection to this world. And I was definitely thinking of the web at that time, that it almost feels like this thing is just kind of moving around like one big hyperlink. So these are all these kind of things that were kind of flooding my consciousness while I was creating these drawings. And one last thing I'll say about them is this particular one, which I do remember the name. It's called Beneath James Central Tower. And James Central Tower is the building that I live in. And there was a huge flood, actually, under my building. So consequently, it kind of has this sort of water quality to it. But this drawing is actually 8 feet wide. So you see it on this small computer screen, but this drawing took me about 3 months to do. And I think just the kind of idea of labor, the idea of craft is something that I'm really, really interested in. But consequently, I think after doing these sort of larger drawings, I needed to give my body a rest, so that there was this real kind of understanding of the way an artist works, whether it's your hand, your eyes, your body. I don't know, these things become registers for me in terms of labor and this sort of other kind of sense. So I want to leave this body of work just for a moment and kind of pivot a little bit to what I'll call analog to digital. Now, going back to Pollock, there was this interesting article that came out in the New York Times, and you might have seen things like this. Is this a real Jackson Pollock? And I mean, there are all these sort of, kind of neo-fraudulent sort of news stories about famous artists. And, the idea of real, I think, is really interesting, especially with regard to reality. That's something that it's obviously a large kind of subject right now. But I was always really interested in like what makes anything real, and I guess in this case it's the author, right, doing the work. But I was really interested in taking this piece of art that you didn't know if it was Jackson Pollock or not, and kind of running with that. And so what I wanted to do was, I started doing a drawing like I normally do, but I was really interested in seeing if I could go inside one of my drawings. I mean, and this is something that I'd received a lot of feedback over, is what would it be like to go in the drawing? And of course, that's a perspectival view from a human perspective. To go in anything is to kind of experience it from our own optical perspective. I mean, which is interesting in sort of regard to the metaverse, as Ellie mentioned, because, the metaverse is very much kind of a sort of tracking of our eyes. So could I do that with one of my drawings inspired by a maybe Pollock painting? So what I did was I actually, and this is just so you know, back in 2009. So, back then, which is like ancient history from a digital standpoint anyway, I didn't really know how to do this. There wasn't any kind of how-to. So, I was kind of importing and exporting between different software. So, I mean, basically what I did was I vectorized my drawing. And for those of you that know what a vector drawing is, you basically import any kind of material. It could be a hand drawing, any image, and a computer, depending on the software you use, can actually vectorize it. It can create like a digital version. And from there, I kind of exported it into a modeling, well, it's a drafting and a modeling software. that most architects use, really just fundamentally just to draft. And you can see the process right here, and you can see the ways by which they kind of got built up, so that by the lower right, you kind of see this 3D model, which is not unlike my three-dimensional drawings. But we decided, and I say we, because I actually teamed up with a colleague of mine named Carter Johnson. And for those of you that know software, we decided to bring it into a software called Maya. And you can see what we did is we were able to do like a fly-through. And this was really interesting because, you know, Carter was like, let's give it some materiality. So he kind of gave it this kind of strange, I don't know, like marbly kind of texture, these kind of shimmery surfaces. And, you know, this is kind of, I mean, not to say that the metaverse didn't really exist as a concept, or there probably were early iterations. In 2009, my dear friend and colleague, Adrienne Rose Janta, has worked in Second Life for many, many years. But for me, you know, at that point, I didn't really know what that was. But it's very interesting looking at these images today that they do really remind me of what has become the kind of early kind of versions of maybe metaverse aesthetics. So these are just some of the images, and you can see very, very simple. I mean, it's not as sort of graphically sophisticated as compared to what you can do now, but it was really interesting to actually go through this process. And actually, this was a web project that was actually published on Girls Club. For those of you that know the Girls Club in Fort Lauderdale, Michelle Weinberg was actually curating these web-based projects on like a kind of a blog for that space. And this was a great opportunity to kind of do something that involved digital processes that was actually published on the web. So from there, I'm going to pivot again. And now I'm going to pivot from digital back to analog. And going back to the same drawing, I took this vector that I was kind of mentioning to you all before. And I was really interested in this idea of scaling. In other words, I was really interested in actually kind of going back into some of my drawings and kind of extrapolating maybe pieces or using them in a different way. And I don't know if a friend of mine is here tonight, Bill Lane, but he's often said to me, you know, go back to some of your earlier work and see if there's a way to kind of reinscribe it. And that's what I did. And I ended up having a great opportunity with Art in Public Places. And they commissioned me to do, actually, it ended up being 3 artworks. But in this particular example here, it was a sculpture. So I was really interested in this idea of, again, kind of creating dimensionality with these shapes. But I began to kind of maybe bring in an element of narrative where they weren't just sort of strictly abstract. So in this case, I was thinking of trees, I was thinking of jellyfish, I was thinking of clouds, you know, things that could have these sort of blurred meanings. And I ended up creating this rendering, and this was actually a building. It was a new building, an affordable housing project for the elderly. It's on Bird Road called Senator Villas. And I was able to create this rendering at first. And the idea was that it was this kind of tree, or this kind of place where if, say, you had grandkids, the kids could come and maybe play inside the sculpture, and you know, the grandparents would watch their grandkids play. And the other thing I want to say is, because I do have a background in architecture, I really love making things. And I think whether it's, you know, a drawing holding a pen, whether it's working in the digital domain to create a model, or just simply to create a construction drawing and a rendering. These are things that I really love to kind of just move in and out of. And that's why when people say, you know, what's your medium? You know, I think it's kind of a stereotypical question. And I don't really have a particular medium. I think that what I really love to do is just to kind of do what I said in the beginning of this presentation, just to kind of move through a kind of creative process. So we ended up building this sculpture. This is a company called United Ironworks, and they're amazing. I've been working with them, and the thing was to try to figure out how to retain that kind of ethereal sort of feel of this kind of cloud structure. We wanted it to feel, I don't know, it's almost like this track between digital and analog, right? It wasn't about a kind of, okay, now it's the real thing, right? How do we retain this quality? And you can see that they have these really wonderful ideas of like the legs of the tree would kind of slip into the clouds. So, I mean, very, very kind of seamless construction and amazing craftsmanship. And the other thing I'll say is that all of this was milled digitally. So in other words, the digital files that I created, they were actually milled using CNC milling, it's called. So all the metal pieces were actually cut with this kind of digital cutting tool. Some of you have probably seen this technology. But at the same time, all of the kind of welding and soldering to create these smooth surfaces are done by hand. So here's the rendering to the left, and you can see the built version to the right. And I love to show them side by side. And one of the reasons is to show, yes, it's very faithful to the original rendering. But the other thing that I really like to do is to say that I don't privilege one over the other. I think that these are both artworks, and I think that these are both very interesting in relation to one another. And with that said, here are just a couple of views of the analog version. So there was this kind of balcony. There's this second floor to the building. And you can see from the balcony the view looking down. And then if the children, or whoever, you don't have to be a child, but if you were to go inside the structure, you could look up and actually see the clouds if there were. Actually, it was a beautiful day, that particular day. So I wanted to also just show you, incidentally, here's a rendering of the building, and you could see where the structure is, the cloud structure, that the sculpture is in relation to the building. But we also did two murals. And I'm not going to sort of show you the original drawings to the murals, but you can see that it was interesting because the murals were similarly vectored, vectorized from some hand drawings I did. And yet, at the same time, they were projected, the images of the vectored versions were projected onto the walls, and they were actually hand painted. I work with an amazing muralist named Patricio Rodriguez, and just did great work on this. And so there's this kind of strange kind of analog to digital to analog, I guess, process here. I also now want to just quickly show you another art and public places project that I'm working on with some similar ideas. And you can see in the upper left, you can see the original drawing, which is the drawing I showed in the beginning. And you can see a kind of blown up version here of that drawing, of that vector drawing. And through it, you see these sort of rectangles. And basically, as I mentioned before, this idea of scaling is really interesting to me. So just keep that in mind. But basically, I was commissioned to do a new project, which is under construction, which is at a metro rail station. It's actually Douglas Station. And they wanted to refurbish this metro rail station, and they wanted to redo the fencing around this metro rail station. And there's this really long kind of auxiliary building. And these are some of the inspirations as well that I kind of thought about, which has to do with like, brain coral in the middle, sea creatures, foliage and camouflage. And all of those things kind of went into my inspiration, as well as just the kind of formality of the drawing. The way I wanted to approach it was, is there a way to kind of extrapolate this drawing into something that could be, kind of a large, very, very large construction system, I guess, for lack of a better term. So what you're seeing here is this kind of transformation of like a block of the drawing, one of the blocks anyway, and this kind of process, it's called a Boolean, and those of you that are in architecture know what that means, but you can see the three-dimensional drawing is a kind of piece of the fence in which this kind of camouflage kind of feel is done through subtraction. I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe this will make more sense. This is the actual renderings for that project. So you can see the metro rail station, and you can see the fencing is more the green, the kind of green motif. And where these sort of carvings or these subtractions are taking place, it's another color. It's the blue. Now, the auxiliary building is the more bluish building. It's kind of inverse. And you could see that the mural is the green, the kind of mural line work. So there's this kind of inverse going on there between those two structures. And you could see some enlarged detail. So the idea is this kind of masking, but I wanted the fence, you know, to be something that wasn't just a fence, something that just divided, you know, people, but something that would actually invite a kind of relationship between inside and outside, public versus semi-public. And actually this station is going to be part of the underline. So I think they're going to augment this station with features for jogging and biking and things of that nature. Of course, this is in process. It's under construction. So no final shots for this one, but I'm also working with the same team here. To the left, you can see the metal you know, each one of these pickets is really a custom piece of art. So it's really great that you can develop a kind of working relationship with people. So it's the same team. So basically the intricacy, you know, of dealing with all of these pieces is something that we kind of developed from the previous project. And so right now you could see the green part of the fencing is up, and the blue will be added for each individual picket once all of that is up. So really a labor of love. And then to the right, Patricia has been working on this mural. Now, keep in mind, that's just the primer. So the green will be added later. But I think it's really interesting because maybe you're beginning to see this idea of scaling. And it isn't just maybe a matter of making something big small, as I did in Pollock's earlier work, but kind of extrapolating elements and actually reconfiguring them in really different ways. And I have to say, shout out to David Martinez Delgado, who's also the Art and Public Places project manager for this. And it's been really interesting to kind of go through this process and just kind of, again, kind of transform a lot of things into other things. And yet they still relate, I think. So I want to finally get to what Ellie was sort of mentioning in the beginning. And I can't really go into all of my digital work. And there's a lot of kind of offshoots to that body of work. But what I will focus on is this a chapter, if you would, called Analog to Digital, and then I would say analog and digital. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to talk a little bit about a project I did at the PAMM called Invasive Species. This is actually going to be about augmented reality. And for those of you who may not be familiar, there's different what I'll call reality-based technologies. There's augmented reality, there's virtual reality, and there's mixed reality. And I mean, I think at some point all of these things were kind of come together into one. Right now, they're kind of different kind of experiences with different aspects and qualities. And I think it's important to talk about this particular project and kind of give it a little bit of space and time for a lot of reasons. I mean, one, it's the PAMM. So it's a Miami-based or South Florida-based space. And I think it's really important to note that this was the very first augmented reality only contemporary art exhibition in the United States. So I just feel it was amazing to be part of this history, really. And the curator on this is Jennifer Inacio. But there was a huge, enormous team that went into this project. So I'm but one of the members of the team that went into this. But essentially at the time, the PAMM received a Knight Foundation grant to do a technology-inspired project. And they decided to do augmented reality. And to their credit, they decided to commission a Miami-based artist or South Florida-based artist. So that was great. You know, I got to be that artist, which is an honor. And Jen, it was interesting because now that you've seen all my drawing work, or not all of it, but you've seen the kind of basis of it, she was similarly interested in actually utilizing my drawing work to kind of explore this medium. So that was one layer to this project. The other one was the environment, as Ellie mentioned in the beginning. And the idea, though, was, well, do we want to be sort of obvious about this being about climate change? You know, how do we want to do this? And it was a really interesting sort of set of issues. I mean, and then the last thing I'll say before I move on is we had no idea how to do this. We had no idea. We really had to figure this out as we went along because there was very little to kind of look at. There were very few precedents. So it was scary. It was a scary process, but hey, if you're an artist, and those of you that are artists, you know, you got to go for it. But in any case, I'll kick off the first, I guess, artwork. And if you do know about AR, you may know that it involves devices that are different than VR. But if not, I'll try to clarify that. VR, you use a headset, and that's the kind of familiar piece of equipment, you know. AR is actually very different because it's very flexible in that all you need is a smartphone and or say an iPad, you know, a tablet. All you need to really do is well, it depends. There's a couple of ways to do it, but the way that we did it at the PAMM is we use QR codes. And one of the reasons, by the way, we did that is that because the building is concrete, we weren't able to use GPS. Now, GPS is something that you can use out in the open, you know, global positioning systems. You know, your phone can track things using satellite. But because the PAMM is so concrete, you know, heavily concrete, we weren't able to do that. So we went with QR codes, which is really simple. And all you really do is scan it. So we would have these sort of markers placed in certain locations in the PAMM, and there was signage, of course, that would accompany that. But when you walked into the space, there was literally nothing there. I mean, there was not really any analog work to kind of supplement, you know, the digital work. There was just nothing there. So that was really interesting in terms of how you even get the audience to engage in such an exhibition. That's a whole nother discussion. But the things that we were thinking about, you know, in terms of this kind of idea of climate change was, let's just think about the future. You know, what would the grounds of this museum be like potentially in the future? And, you know, if you get literal about it, yeah, maybe it wouldn't even be there, right? But we didn't want to be so kind of heavy with it. We wanted to be a little playful with it, even though the subject matter is not very playful, but we wanted to kind of just speculate with an open heart. So we, in this case, this is actually the one piece that we did inside the museum. It's called Mezbug. And this was, you could see the upper left is the actual painting. And by the way, this painting was also that inspiration for that drawing I kind of had in the beginning where I kind of forgot the name. We'll call it at Mezbug, I guess, for the sake of it. But what I did was I vectorized Mezbug and I modeled Mezbug. But the other thing I did was I modeled the entire PAMM. It was really wonderful that the building engineers of the museum gave me the digital files. So basically, I was able to create an entire 3D model of the museum. And it was really interesting because I was sort of finding the artwork, not through kind of the placing of objects as you would say plop art, but really citing the work both in the digital domain and the analog domain, kind of in the same, at the same time. It was kind of, I was testing it in the computer and I was testing it on the grounds of the museum. So this was kind of a very strange, kind of like split between realities experience. So you can see Mesbug found its home in the Learning Theater at the PAMM. And this is kind of what Mesbug ended up being. Now, again, this is 2017. And I always bring this up because, you know, it's a really simple digital, as you might call, file, right? But I think at the time, this artwork, it was kind of mesmerizing because a lot of us had never experienced this. So essentially, you can see on the right, you would literally see nothing unless you look through a device. And it was always interesting because you'd see people sort of walking through the space, seeing other people acting like this woman who wasn't really in front of anything. So I thought that was a really interesting and strange kind of uncanny experience as well. But basically, you could literally walk around Mesbug in real time, and it would be where it is. It also, you could animate it by touching the screen, and it was really the first artwork. So it was a really great beginning. It was a really great kickoff. But of course, like in my drawings, we wanted to push the envelope a little bit. So we did that, I would say, in the next couple of artworks. So again, going back to drawing, this was a drawing that I showed you in the beginning. And the idea for scaling, I really wanted to sort of take this one, you know, almost to like the nth degree. Like, how far can we really take this? You know, like Alice falls through the looking glass, and how far could we be Alice, you know? And I basically took the entire drawing and just spread it across the entire east terrace of the PAMM. And I wanted to do something more as well. I noticed that there are these amazing hanging gardens. So the idea was that, like in my drawing work, particularly in the Pollock examples, where part of the drawing would be, there were these kind of extruded elements. I actually had part of the drawing kind of extrude up into the gardens. So the idea would be that in the future, something like a jellyfish or like a man-o'-war, if you're familiar with Portuguese man-o'-wars, would kind of have mutated or evolved to the point where they would sort of terraform, you know, onto land. And so this was called terrafish. And instead of, say, like a man-o'-war, if you've ever seen them, they hunt with sort of tentacles. This would be the opposite, that the tentacles would kind of feed off of the hanging gardens. So this is kind of how it compared to the digital version. You can see, and I guess they're both digital versions, but the top was kind of the rendering, and then the bottom to the left was the AR version, the augmented reality version. And again, you could walk through these in real time, this creature. But as you can see, the only evidence would be looking through the looking glass, so to speak, which would be that device, whether it be a smartphone or like an iPad or something. So that was really interesting. I mean, the other thing I'll say was the size was really big, and we didn't really know, you know, if we could even accomplish an artwork to the scale that we did, but we did. We did. And here are some shots, various shots, and you can see with AR, because you're looking through a cell phone, really the views are in the vertical, right? Basically, they're portrait. So I think this is also really interesting because the metaverse, for example, you know, unless you're on your cell phone, most of the time you're looking through, you know, a headset or your laptop or a combination. So that would be more of a landscape kind of view. But in AR, portrait is really the more conventional view. But anyway, you can see some of the details here of this creature and how it would feed off the hanging gardens. And I'll show you one more artwork. Again, a very similar idea of scaling. Once again, kind of taking from that original drawing from the fake Pollock. And basically, I just wanted to take this and just cover it. And what you're looking at, the larger image here, is if any of you, and I'm sure most of you probably have, visited the Pérez Art Museum, there's a plaza called the Night Plaza, and it's kind of sandwiched between the Frost Science Museum. and the west side of the PAMM. And you can see these sort of, it's interesting because they're almost already futuristic, I would say, or these kind of pods. And you can actually sit on some of them where these just kind of beautiful kind of, I don't know, just fauna and flora kind of vegetational zones. They're really, really beautiful. So I just wanted to like say, all right, what if I just covered this whole thing with a drawing? You know, what would that be? And we came to, Jen and I came to realize that we weren't allowed to infringe. There's this sort of make-believe boundary through the center of this plaza where half of it kind of goes towards the Science Museum, the other half goes towards the Art Museum. So we could only kind of stay onto the west side. And that was fun. So I decided to create this almost like growth, you know, this kind of growth concept, which kind of, again, was kind of sparked from the original drawing. And, you know, I thought to myself, well, because there's vegetation kind of already in the plaza, you know, how could I sort of piggyback on top of that? You know, what might be this kind of creature, almost like something that would be kind of mimicking the vegetation, kind of biomimicry, if you would, that could also feed off of the vegetation. But maybe instead of going from the bottom up, it would be maybe from the top down. So I had this idea of doing this kind of cloud creature that would actually retract. You know, if you look at the bottom images, you could see that it would retract as just sort of a hovering cloud that kind of mirrored these pods. And this sort of creature would actually, when it was hungry, would kind of come down and kind of feed off of the vegetation in the plaza. And you can see to the left, this is another example of, you can kind of see it's cut off of the QR code and some of the signage. So this was another very large piece, and I'm just amazed that we pulled it off. You know, that now that I know more about these technologies than I did then, but we did. And here's some other views. And what I really liked about this was I was really interested in, again, this kind of biomimicry, but in the future, right, where, you know, this thing would kind of take on some of the colorations of the vegetation, but at some point would fuse with the vegetation. Other points would kind of hover. But the cloud, you know, the kind of cloud would also kind of mimic the architecture of the pods. I just want to end with one more chapter, I guess, which is kind of more as, I mean, Ellie kind of preferenced that I'm a philosopher, but I do want to put this out there in terms of just reality, this idea of reality, because it's an interesting topic, again, as of late. So, I mean, this is just something I'm thinking about. So in contrast to the PAMM stuff was very obvious, I think, aesthetically in terms of artwork to reality. In other words, very bright colors, obviously. You know, once you look through the screen of your phone, I mean, I think it was quite evident where the artwork was. Now, this particular object, I mean, it really has no world, right? It's just, the world is really just the computer, but it has a shadow. So the only thing that kind of gives any kind of world away to it is the fact that it's tethered by its own shadow, but that's really it. I took that object one day and I was walking along the beach, Miami Beach, and I just, you know, figured, let's just put it there along the ocean. And, you know, I posted it to Instagram. And so I got this comment and it said, "Where is this?" And I wrote "Another world." And I think what struck me about this person's comment was that I realized that she didn't know that this was augmented reality, that she was actually fooled. And that really struck me as a very sort of different experience as an artist than the PAMM and the Pérez experience, where, you know, you go there expecting to see something. Whereas in this case, she wanted to know where this was, like it was real, but then what is real? And so these are some things I've been thinking about. Now, I wanted to go back to this sculpture. So, you know, to the left, as I said earlier, this is a kind of, in a sort of architecturally traditional sense, the left is a rendering, one might call a rendering. And to the right is the sculpture. And often one is sort of subservient to the other, where you kind of understand one is not real, one is real. You know, that would be the kind of, in my opinion, kind of old way of sort of thinking about reality. But I did an experiment. So I did I'm just going to see if this works as a, okay. So this is a walkthrough of the analog version. And this is a walkthrough of the AR version. So my question is, what is real? I guess I want to just maybe leave you with this. So do reality-based technologies merely duplicate analog reality? And I've also been thinking about, you know, power and control, you know, where does agency lie? And then finally, I want to say, you know, what if in reality there are parallel realities? And so if there are parallel realities, what are the ramifications between exporting and importing, say, digital doubles, twins, or shadows between them? So these are just some of the things I've been thinking about. So I'll kind of leave that hanging there. And I just want to say, in conclusion, thank you so much.
Oh my goodness, my head is spinning with questions and answers to questions that I went in with, and a whole lot of new ideas to play around with, as you have been doing. This has been just so wonderful. Thank you so much. There is so much interconnectedness to parts of your work that I would never have dreamt of in the past. Jackson Pollock took me by surprise. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Damie.
Thank you.
For your contributions. See you in 3 weeks. Good night.